For a long time, life felt slightly out of sync. Not enough to alarm you, not enough to stop functioning, just enough to notice if you paid attention. Your body moved forward, but something inside lagged behind, like an echo arriving late. You would finish a conversation and only then realize you hadn't fully been there. You would complete tasks without remembering when you started them. You would reach the end of a day and feel as though you had been present for none of it. At first, you called it distraction, then stress, then fatigue. Those explanations were easy, acceptable, normal, so you didn't question them. There were moments when you paused for no clear reason, standing in doorways, sitting on the edge of beds, staring at walls that offered nothing to look at. Nothing dramatic happened in those moments. No memories surfaced. No thoughts announced themselves. Just a quiet, uncomfortable awareness, like you were waiting for something that refused to arrive. You learned to move past it. You filled silence with sound. You kept your hands busy. You stayed occupied long enough to avoid noticing the pause. But the pauses kept returning. And over time, you realized something unsettling. The discomfort wasn't coming from confusion. It was coming from recognition. When anxiety surfaced, it didn't feel chaotic. It felt compressed, like too many thoughts sharing too little space. When sadness arrived, it didn't feel heavy. It felt distant, like something stepping away from you. When anger appeared, it wasn't explosive. It was resistant, tight, contained, held back. These emotions didn't feel like reactions to the world. They felt like responses to something internal, as if you weren't reacting to events, but to yourself. You noticed patterns. You explained your decisions long after they were made. You replayed conversations that were already finished. You imagined saying things that no one would ever hear, not because you wanted to change the outcome, but because something inside you hadn't accepted it yet. There was a strange familiarity to it, like speaking into an empty room and still expecting a response. You began to sense it during quiet moments, late at night, early in the morning, in the spaces between tasks. Presence, not external, not imagined. Something that felt aware, not watching with judgment, not observing with curiosity, just present. It didn't interrupt. It didn't comment. It didn't guide. It waited. You felt it most strongly when you were alone but not lonely, when the world wasn't demanding anything from you. In those moments, you felt a subtle pressure, not pushing, not pulling, simply existing, like a question that hadn't been asked out loud. You tried to identify it. Was it intuition, conscience, memory? None of those fit. Those things speak. This didn't. You began noticing how often you spoke, internally, not in full sentences. Fragments, rehearsals, explanations. You justified choices no one challenged. You defended actions no one criticized. You clarified intentions no one misunderstood. It was constant, quiet, relentless, and slowly, something became impossible to ignore. You weren't preparing these explanations for other people. You were delivering them to someone. The realization unsettled you not because it was strange, but because it felt obvious in hindsight. You had always sensed it, the feeling of being slightly observed, the sense of internal distance, the awareness that something inside you remained still while everything else moved. You tried to dismiss the thought. You told yourself this was overthinking, philosophical noise, mental abstraction. But the more you dismissed it, the clearer it became. There were two positions inside you. One that acted, one that noticed, one that spoke, one that listened, one that reacted to the world, one that watched you react. They never argued. That was the strangest part. There was no conflict, no inner dialogue, no debate, just coexistence. You realized that even when you felt certain, something inside you remained quiet, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. When you felt confident, it stayed neutral. When you felt regret, it stayed present. When you felt proud, it stayed unchanged. This presence didn't move with your emotions. It remained steady. You began to feel it during moments of explanation, when you told yourself why you stayed, why you left, why you tolerated things longer than you should have. You felt the explanation land, not with relief but with a sense of being heard. Not understood. Heard. That difference mattered. Understanding brings closure. Being heard brings stillness. And stillness was rare. You started noticing something else. The explanations never stopped the behavior. They never changed the outcome. They never resolved the feeling. They simply continued, like updates delivered to someone who already knew the story. That's when the thought surfaced, slowly, without force. You hadn't been thinking out loud. You had been reporting your actions, your decisions, your rationalizations, as if something inside you was tracking everything. Not to judge, not to interfere, just to remain aware. The idea stayed with you. It followed you into quiet spaces. It sat beside you when you rested. It watched as you filled silence with distraction. And the more you noticed it, the harder it became to pretend it wasn't there. You realized why silence felt uncomfortable. Because silence was where this presence became impossible to ignore. In silence, there was nothing to drown it out. No noise, no urgency, no external focus, just awareness. You began to understand something unsettling. You weren't uncomfortable with being alone. You were uncomfortable with being seen. Seen by the part of you that never looked away. And deep down, you knew this wasn't new. It had always been there, waiting. At some point, awareness stops being subtle. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive dramatically. It simply becomes impossible to ignore. You noticed it one day in a moment that should have passed unnoticed. Nothing emotional happened. Nothing important was decided. You were still, physically still, and for once you didn't rush to fill the space. That's when it happened. The feeling shifted. Not outward, inward. You became aware of the observer as something separate from thought. Not a voice, not a narrative. Position. A place inside you that had always been watching from the same distance. And for the first time, you didn't try to explain yourself to it. You just noticed it noticing you. The recognition didn't feel enlightening. Felt exposed. Like realizing you'd been speaking to someone who never responded. Not because they weren't listening, but because they didn't need clarification. You saw the pattern clearly now. Every internal explanation, every justification, every rehearsal, they weren't attempts to understand reality. They were attempts to align with this silent presence. You understood why the explanations never brought peace. You weren't trying to convince yourself of the truth. You were trying to catch up to it. This part of you had always been ahead, not in knowledge, but in acceptance. It didn't resist what happened. It didn't argue with what was. It simply registered it. That's when you noticed something unsettling. This observer had been present during moments you avoided remembering. Times when you felt smaller than you admitted. Moments when you compromised quietly. Decisions you justified but never felt aligned with. It had seen all of it. And yet, it had never withdrawn. You realized why certain memories felt unfinished. Why certain thoughts kept returning. Why some moments replayed without emotional charge, just clarity. This part of you wasn't trying to punish you. It was trying to be acknowledged. The confrontation wasn't dramatic. There was no inner collapse. Just a quiet understanding. You had been living slightly ahead of yourself. Moving, choosing, reacting, while something inside you remained still, recording everything you passed too quickly. For the first time, you didn't feel watched. You felt accompanied. That's when things began to change. Not externally, but internally. You stopped narrating your life. You stopped rehearsing conversations that had already ended. You stopped explaining your choices to an invisible audience. Not because you forced yourself to, but because there was nothing left to explain. The observer didn't need convincing. It never had. You noticed the effect slowly. Silence became less uncomfortable. Pauses no longer demanded filling. Moments of stillness stopped feeling like wasted time. They felt intentional. You began responding instead of reacting. Not because you were calmer, but because there was less internal noise competing for attention. The world didn't become softer. People didn't become easier. Situations didn't suddenly resolve themselves. But something fundamental shifted. You were no longer split between action and awareness. They began moving together. You noticed how differently you experienced moments now. When something went wrong, there was less internal resistance. When something went right, there was less need to cling to it. When something ended, it felt complete. Not because it was painless, but because it was acknowledged. You understood something important. Awareness doesn't fix your life. It changes your relationship with it. This is why the observer had never spoken. It didn't need to guide you. It didn't need to warn you. Its role was never intervention. It was presence. You realized something else. Something quieter, but deeper. This observer was not a separate part of you. It was the part of you that never left. The part that stayed when you dissociated. The part that remained when you numbed out. The part that watched when you avoided. Not to judge, not to control, but to remain whole. That's why running never worked. That's why distraction only delayed the discomfort. You were never running from pain. You were running from integration. And now there was nothing left to outrun. You didn't become fearless. You didn't become enlightened. You didn't suddenly understand everything. You simply became present in a way you hadn't been before. You stopped narrating your worth. Stopped defending your boundaries internally. Stopped arguing with your own decisions after they were made. Because there was no longer a divide between the one who acted and the one who observed. This didn't make you perfect. It made you honest. And honesty has a weight to it. A stillness. A quiet gravity. You now understood why clarity always arrived in silence. Why stillness felt unsettling before. Why awareness had felt like pressure instead of peace. You weren't uncomfortable with silence. You were uncomfortable with being fully present. Now, presence no longer felt threatening. Felt grounding. You hadn't found answers. You had found alignment. And that's when the final realization settled, not as a thought, but as a knowing. You had never been arguing with the world. You had never been rehearsing for others. You had never been seeking validation externally. You had been speaking to yourself, reporting your life, explaining your choices, justifying your direction, not because you were lost, but because part of you was waiting for the rest to arrive. Now you were here, fully, quietly, and for the first time the conversation ended. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because you were finally listening.